Welcome to the fourth in our series of 5 podcasts for National Work-Life Week 2013. Join me, Liz Morris, as I explore in these 5 podcasts, with the input of 5 leading experts, the possibility of having it all. A full life with a good sense of life balance, high performance at work and well-being. With the full-on demands of modern life, is this really possible to achieve, or do we need to sacrifice at least one aspect to be able to achieve another? Joining me throughout this series of podcasts in the studio are Avril Lyman, internationally renowned executive coach and author, Professor Carrie Cooper, CBE, Pro Vice-Chancellor for External Relations and Distinguished Professor of Organisational Psychology and Health at Lancaster University Management School, Chair of the Academy of Social Sciences, President of Relate, and immediate past President of the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. Ben Warnsborough-Jones, a Special Forces soldier in the British Army, now combining this work as a reservist with supporting civilian leaders to build highly effective teams. And via audio conference joining us is Suzanne Jacobs, lead researcher on our most recently published paper exploring human intrinsic motivation and the impact of trust on performance and well-being. And John Dent, physical trainer and nutritionist to elite sportsmen and women and senior executives. I'm also delighted to introduce to you a special guest expert on this podcast, Dr. Simon Burnett, who led one of our recent research programs looking at the impact of positive relationships both in the workplace and at home on well-being and performance and engagement. In our first podcast, we explored the relationship between performance, balance and well-being, and what it really is that motivates us. We learnt from our panel of experts how to identify what it is that's really important to us, our core needs and values, and how, when these are not being met, our performance suffers, as well as our well-being and ability to have a full and balanced life. In our second podcast, we asked the question, whose balance is it anyway? And explored with Ben, Avril and Carrie the possibility of choosing and directing your internal dialogue and your actions, with examples from working in the city and also when being deployed to a war zone. In our third podcast, John helped us to understand how we could work with our bodies to build good physical and mental well-being, and by doing so, drive high performance and build the capability to have a full and balanced life. In this podcast, we're going to take a look at how positive relationships at home and at work enable you to build a balanced and full life and what you can do to achieve this. Let's start by looking at the business and individual case for even considering this subject. Relationships, of course, are very personal, especially if they're relationships with loved ones, and perhaps some would feel should not be the subject for discussion in the workplace. After all, work is work and home is home. There is a strong body of evidence that good relationships are one of the strongest buffers against stress and anxiety. But what is the evidence that building professional relationships which are strong, open and honest is good for business? Carrie, you're wearing many hats in your professional life, both with a business or organisational focus, for example at Lancaster University Management School, and also with a more personal focus, for example as president of the relationship charity Relate. What is the evidence that good relationships are good for business?
Oh, the evidence is that the more you can sort out the interpersonal problems that go on in work environments, the more effective you're going to be as a team.
And Simon, What did the research programme that you led with working families and the relationship charity 1+1 show us about the impact of relationships, both at home and at work, on our well-being and ability to perform?
The research that I was involved in, along Working Families and 1+1, conducted and ran for a year and a half, showed statistically the positive connection or association between people who have strong relationships at home and then higher work engagement. So the two were connected in this way. And the people that we found with the follow-up evidence, the people that were best able to navigate the work and home life and perform strongly in both were able to draw barriers between them, were able to step from one role into another. That's the most important element, actually, was the skills of working flexibly that are involved in establishing positive work-life balance, very similar to those in actually developing strong relationships, not only with colleagues but with our partners and with our children at home. They're what we do to maintain functional, healthy relationships both at home and at work. They are the ability to negotiate, to reason with people, whether we think they're being reasonable at the time or not, but to actually to listen, to see what is it people expect of us, to communicate. So all of these core skills that maintain happy, healthy relationships at home are essentially, we may describe them in different ways, but they're essentially the skills that we use, whether explicitly or tacitly, in the workplace. So whether I'm negotiating with my line manager about how much work I have to do before I can go home, or when it's acceptable to call me, when it's not acceptable, or in terms of what deadlines are achievable, these are fairly similar core skills to how I may discuss things with my partner at home, whether it be buying a new car, where to go on holiday, or who's going to do the washing up. It's just about that fair recognition of ability and time that is available, and comradeship between the two parties.
Suzanne, looking at the research that you led, how could we use the concept of intrinsic drivers to frame our understanding of and perhaps provide clues to how we can develop good relationships at work?
We are tribal. To be able to belong to a group is hugely, hugely protective. We do know that exclusion, and this is very interesting when you think about virtual teams nowadays and working far more remotely, but there is a direct link between isolation and depression. It is very important to understand that the brain reacts very negatively in a survival and threat mode if we are excluded from our group. And when we are excluded, it actually triggers off the same areas in the brain as physical pain does. But how we perceive and create the fact in our world is how we will respond based on whether we see ourselves being excluded or not excluded, even if the intention was not to exclude. When we're thinking about belong and connect, our significance and position within the team in which we're working, our ability to voice our ideas and to be recognised, and to feel that we're being treated fairly as well. And actually that's very much around shifting our own perception and how we're about to behave. But it's also hugely, hugely important that we start to recognise when other people may be having their intrinsic drivers being quashed in any way, and perhaps the behaviour that you're witnessing is really trying to ask yourself about what's going on underneath. And perhaps if people listening to this are managing others, perhaps in a change situation or a day-to-day situation, had your intention be to make sure that they were fully included, but maybe they feel for some reason they were excluded. So it's getting away from where your intention perhaps was in terms of where you were placing that with the other person, because our perception is absolutely unique. How they will interpret it will also be absolutely unique and isn't going to necessarily be as you would see it. As I was saying earlier, what's fair to you may not be fair to somebody else. It's incredibly important to try to understand what may be going on underneath, and then try to understand their perception. Whilst my intention maybe as a manager or as an individual in my team wasn't to treat somebody unfairly, if their perception is that they've been treated unfairly, the brain will be in a threat situation. So whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, it's incredibly important to firstly understand about it and then to have a conversation. and we talk about these essential conversations at the level of the intrinsic motivation, at the level of perception. If we can approach our colleagues by understanding the intrinsic needs of the individuals, we can hopefully prevent some of the traps that we inadvertently walk into, but also if somebody is reacting in a threat or defensive mode, try to ask what's going on underneath.
Carrie, I wonder if I could bring you in here, just reflecting on our conversation so far. What are your views on personal responsibility for making relationships work?
It really is important for all of us to be responsible. We don't just leave it up to managers. We see things not working well. We have to say it. And line managers have their own problems, just like we do. And developing a good relationship with your line manager, being able to say what you think and feel, and coming up with solutions, I think, is the critical dimension. We have fewer people in the work environment. Line managers have a lot heavier workloads than they used to have. And the last thing in the world they need is for you to come and whinge and just complain without a solution. Come with a solution and how it might work, and take responsibility for ensuring that it does. The work environment is about the psychological contract. It's about, at every level, you have a psychological contract with your line manager, you have one with your colleagues, you have one with your own subordinates. Really, I always thought, it was about a couple of weeks ago, they had something called Hug the Boss Day. And I started to reflect on it, and they asked me to comment on it. And I thought that was really a good idea, because you know what? Very seldom does anybody ever tell a boss that he or she's doing a good job. Right? We all expect our bosses to tell us when we're doing a good job, and certainly we're going to be told if we're not doing a good job. That we expect that. We would like that. We want that. But when do we ever do the opposite? So I started to think about, there's got to be some reciprocity here. We want to be told by our bosses that we value you, ergo you got these options for work-life balance. We trust you, so you don't have to work long hours. We're trying to create a less of a long hours culture, et cetera, et cetera. When do we ever say thank you? Thank you for that to people who manage us? Rarely. So funny enough, we all probably demand more from our bosses, from shop floor all the way to top floor, but rarely ever do the thank you. And so I thought it was actually quite a good idea to have Hug the Boss. That was a metaphor for just telling the boss you really value what they're doing.
Avril, I'd like to explore further with you about the challenge that managers have. Carrie has spoken about taking personal responsibility for relationship quality at work and the importance of recognising your boss as a human being if you want him or her to recognise you as one. And for the manager, perhaps taking time to focus on nurturing relationships can seem like an unwanted overhead, especially given the intensification of work that we all have.
I see no problem with good business and good care of people that we get. It strikes me as sometimes, all these decades on, it's as if I'm trying to practice the black arts that people haven't got. I think that starts with, to my mind, when I'm looking at good leadership in a way starts with knowing your people, and therefore knowing immediately that anything is off kilter. And that takes a certain emotional awareness and an ability to read the situation. But also to have that self-awareness, first of all. I think you've got to get the beam out of your own eye before the mote out of somebody else's. Always back to know thyself. And being a good role model. And looking at the outputs, perhaps, rather than the hours served. What's the quality of work like? And having that conversation about how you can get the best out of people. But then also picking up on difference. If somebody's behaviour or demeanour changes, having the tricky conversation, which doesn't need to be that tricky, but we find that it's the biggest area of cowardice in most organisations. And to go up to somebody and say, you're not quite yourself, how dangerous can that be? They may well say, what do you mean? Because they know there's going to be another round of cuts, they'll deny everything. But at the same time, the fact that somebody's expressed concern and maybe has some data. You've just been a bit off in the meeting, it's not like you, or this piece of work is not as good as it usually is, and I just wondered what was happening. Having those tricky, difficult conversations shows a respect, shows interest, and also shows a knowledge of that person. Also noticing what habits are happening. Are people staying later and later? Are they fussing? Are they becoming obsessed with things? And really having the conversations about what would enable them to give their best work. This is not about social work. It's not about mollycoddling people. It's about giving people the opportunity to do their best job, which is actually something that is incredibly good for their soul as well. It gives meaning to life, to have accomplishment. We all want to feel we're accomplishing. And so often we can feel we're not. It's not true usually. It's a perceptual error we make. But having a leader or a manager who's pointing out how well we've done really lifts the mood. And somebody who's concerned enough to ensure that we're looking after ourselves is a great benefit.
And Ben, some might say that a focus on relationships is a soft subject, not really about work. How is it perceived in special forces? Do you even consider this when preparing for deployment?
So there is concurrent activity. One is the things that you can see, which is that you're learning the skills, it's remind and revise. So I am going into this theatre of war. This will be my role. This is what I'll be trying to do. It could be an overt role or a covert role. With that, you're training with the guys that you're going to be going out with. So there's another series of activities that's going on. It's learning the trigger points for people when they're really stressed, when they're really tired. How do you recognise those things, and how do you deal with them? And this isn't necessarily just a team leader that's doing it. Every single person is going through the same thing. It's building that bond. So you may have worked with these guys extensively before, but still, before you go out again, it's just drawing it up. It's then taking it up to the next level again and just preparing yourselves to go out again. And I think this is the same, but less obvious in normal kind of work that we do. There are multiple levels. You don't know for people, somebody may be going through a divorce at a time, they may be moving house. There are a whole number of things that could be personally affecting people that change how they respond at work. It's looking not just at the surface level of what's happening, but just understanding that may be driven by something that's happening underneath as well. One of the main challenges, one of the things that we were trying to overcome was, I suppose it's this idea of the grand plan, the strategy, what people are trying to do. But then actually the difference between having a plan and making things happen being very, very different. And the idea of empowerment, so individual empowerment, empowering the people that work with and for you, getting the buy-in to the plan so that the plan actually happens. And it's something that I think the military do really, really well. This is where we are, this is what we're trying to do here, and this is what it means for you, and just taking that and cascading it down, all the way down to, and aligning it to the boots on the ground. Because without that, I suppose it's having a purpose, isn't it? It's really making people feel that they have a purpose, and their purpose fits in with the overall plan. And I think that's important for people. And this is why I think on the agenda now there's a lot about employee engagement, and it's banded around a lot, but what does it mean? And for me it's aligning people to the plan. It doesn't have to be more complicated, and for us we'll say with quite a lot of pride that the Special Forces is one of the strongest teams that you could possibly have.
And building on what Ben's shared about relationships and their place in building effective teams, Carrie, how can we do this in business? I think back in the 1970s and 80s there was a focus on a process called T groups. Were you involved in these? And what was their effectiveness?
Oh, I was. In fact, I came over to the UK and my PhD was evaluating the effectiveness of these. and they were very effective. And basically what T groups did is they were vehicles by which work groups, by the way, they also ran them for people who came from disparate organizations, not in a work team. But when they were really effective is when you brought work teams together to look at your relationships. Not to do a task, not a task at all. It's about to look at what's going on. Who's playing what role? How do we perceive one another? It's kind of quasi-psychoanalytic, but it's not psychoanalytic. It is making people be honest with one another. That builds teams properly. You know, Fred, I see you, you know, every time we come up with an idea, you oppose it.
Yeah.
That's my perception to you, Fred. It's not helpful. Doesn't help us. Come up with, you know, please. And then other people can confirm or disconfirm it. So Fred's learning about himself. But you're trying to work on the problems that teams have. All teams have problems. They have people that play dysfunctional roles. They have people who are very positive. They have social emotional specialists who try to resolve conflicts. They have all sorts of different funny roles go on in work environments. And only when you share from time to time what's going on will it ever improve. But I think it would be useful to, in this day and age, reinvent that. With all the pressures on work teams now, to reinvent a mechanism by which teams can talk about how they see one another, how roles could be improved. Yeah. And also, it actually builds a much more kind of family kind of culture within the work environment.
Well, it's one thing to be honest and open with the person you love and want to spend the rest of your life with. It's a very different thing, perhaps, from being confident in your ability to do that with your boss or your colleagues. Simon, as part of the output of the research that you led, there are some suggested actions for managers and employees as a start point that could help each one of us to recognise and respect the other. And now this has been tested in a follow-up study and shown to be a really useful way to start building positive relationships. Could you just talk us through what these suggested actions are?
Yeah, so there are 5 simple things that line managers can put into practice almost straight away. They were deliberately built out of the research that was performed, and they were deliberately designed to be very simple to slot into the daily working schedule that can actually have a measurable, tangible, and immediate effect. So the first point I would suggest would be to for a line manager to have a conversation with each of their team members about something that specifically happens outside of work, whether that is as simple as a moment over the water cooler to say, how was your weekend, what did you get up to on Saturday, or whatever it may be, or it could be something about one's family, to actually allow for a small space from something outside of work in the workplace. The second one, quite simply, is to leave work on time, at least once a week where possible. And most importantly is to support your team members in doing the same thing. A great deal of this area revolves around the notion of permission, that if people see that they have permission within the organisational culture to leave work on time from people that higher up the organisational rungs, then they will be able to feel confident in doing so themselves. The third one, quite similarly, is to switch off mobile phones or to not check mobiles and emails once you've left the office. And again, very importantly, to encourage your team to do the same. It's about establishing when you are and when are not available. Even if this is just one time a week, it carves out that space that can then be dedicated to nurturing one's family or personal life. By doing this, it manages people's expectations upon you, whether that's people at higher levels, similar or below you. So the fourth one is then, for a line manager, simply to ask the expertise of your team members in terms of how can the tasks allocated to them be performed better, what is the best approach to them in terms of their time management, and to really gain their expertise. They were hired for a reason, and presumably that reason is that they were the best person at the point of interview that could be found for the job. So take advantage of these experts that you have in role. And finally, I think most important for all of us, but particularly for a line manager in establishing this culture of permission, is to prioritise something outside of work with your family or friends that you've been putting off for work, and actually do it, even if it's just once a week, whether it's a a phone call with a parent or friend, going for coffee, going for lunch, and an outing on the weekend, whatever it may be, actually prioritise and do. So to not only to carve out the time, but actually take advantage of it. And then you've got the ready-made thing for the next week for the conversation with a team member of what you did outside of work. So similarly for team members, there's a deliberately designed set of activities that mirror those for the line manager that team members can perform at least once a week throughout the week, so whether it's one a day or we do all 5 on the Monday, whatever it may be. They're deliberately engineered based on the research to improve work engagement and relationship quality. So the first one is to have a conversation with your colleagues, including line manager, about something that happens outside of work. So as we mentioned before, to really enable the space, allow the permission and space for non-work activities to exist in the workspace. We're not saying that they should be all you talk about or they should last all day, but just to have a conversation just for a few minutes about one non-work event or activity. Secondly, the research suggested that taking advantage or seeking out and actually forwarding a personal development opportunity is very important, is central to the roles of engagement, of how we're actually motivated as people to perform at work and at home, and really to find that space to better ourselves with some development activity. Number 3 would be to, similarly to the line manager, would be to prioritise something that prioritise an activity with family or with friends that have been putting off due to work, again, to carve out space in the non-work time for something which is not centred around work, so that our lives aren't just continuously in this cycle of thinking, being and doing around work. So really breaking the cycle of work impacting on personal life not having any space for itself, and then that negativity getting carried into work and affecting our performance. By breaking the cycle, really finding some quality time for our friends, for family, for children, whatever that may be, outside of work, and protecting it and investing in it. 4, quite simply, is at least once a week where possible, is leave work on time. The simple things like this can be managed if we effectively manage our time, our relationships, expectations upon us, but commit to saying every Tuesday, every Thursday, whatever it may be, I'm going to leave work on time, and what do I need to do to enable that to happen? So leaving work on time is quite a simple way of managing expectations and improving our work-life balance and reducing the conflict that can travel from work into our family life and then cycle back from family into our work performance. One way to manage this would be to establish a real hard deadline, so buying tickets or arranging a specific time to meet a friend for dinner or whatever it may be, a time that cannot be moved, so the time before it has to be used as effectively and efficiently as possible to still meet all of our work deadlines and then get out and actually meet our social and personal deadlines as well. And number 5, again mirroring one of the recommended activities for line managers, which should hopefully be giving permission to it, is to switch off the work mobile and not check messages or emails once we leave the office, hopefully on time as well, one day a week. So to really establish that separate physical and mental break between work and non-work to allow both to actually benefit.
Carrie, Ben, Simon, Suzanne and Avril, thank you for sharing your insights. So what will you do? How will you develop the relationships you have at work and at home? In our next podcast, I'll explore with Avril the role of strengths and talents and how working with these will increase your ability to perform, your well-being, and a sense of a full and balanced life. Until next time, from me, Liz Morris, and with huge thanks to our panel of experts and our sponsor, Santander, until next time, goodbye.